Watching the front of the train get further and further away, Atami remained unusually calm. He turned his head to look at the massive object covered by a torn cloth next to him. Taking his time, he pulled back the tarp covering it, revealing a rocket missile right in front of him. When the soldiers from the train car chased after him, they were instantly stunned by the sight before them. Atami had already pressed the rocket's launch button. Atami was the exact same badass who wiped out an entire army in the first movie. And this time, Atami was taking on the Soviet army. The story goes back to the Winter War that broke out between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1939. Even though Atami single-handedly killed over 300 Soviet soldiers, ultimately Finland lost the war and had to cede 10% of its land to the Soviet Union, forcing 420,000 Finnish civilians to leave their homes. The previous movie was about Atami wiping out a German army over some gold panning in 1944. The year is now 1946, and Atami was driving a truck back to his former hometown, planning to move his old house away. Although 2 years had passed, Atami's combat prowess was still widely renowned. The Soviet soldiers on duty couldn't help but point and whisper when they saw his passport. But since the two countries had signed the Moscow Armistice, the soldiers had no reason to stop Atami from entering with his passport. The next day, after driving through a desolate and uninhabited wasteland, Atami slammed on the brakes and parked in front of his house. This place once held his happy family life. The furniture inside the rooms had long been covered in dust. Looking at the photos of himself and his family, still sitting on the cabinet, Atami couldn't help but feel overwhelmingly grief-stricken, because his beloved wife and son had died in that winter war. And the officer who murdered his wife and child, Igor, was currently locked up in a Siberian prison. Because Igor slaughtered innocents indiscriminately during the war, sparing not even women and children, he was thrown into death row. Now, Atami's return to move his house was discovered by the border guards and reported to their superiors. The brass decided to release Igor to deal with Atami. After all, the legendary immortal god of war was the very monster created by his indiscriminate killing. By this time, Atami had already dismantled his old house into logs and loaded them onto his truck. He wanted to take these memory-filled logs back to Finland to rebuild his home. However, what he didn't know was just how bloody and brutal this journey home would be. Soon, a squad of Soviet soldiers appeared at the intersection, inspecting passing vehicles. Seeing this, Atami didn't dare to act rashly. To make matters worse, another military vehicle blocked his escape route. Atami had no choice but to hand his passport to the inspecting soldier, then watched their every move through the rearview mirror. The commanding officer in the military vehicle was none other than the recently released Igor. Seeing the passport handed to him by the soldier, he immediately recognized the person in the photo as the Finnish god of war.
I think the legend has been homesick. That is all that is left from his life before. Go on.
The man who stepped out of the vehicle lit a Molotov cocktail in his hand, preparing to burn the logs on the truck. The soldiers behind also drew their daggers and walked toward him. Atami wasn't in a hurry to make a move. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the distance between the two men and himself. He was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. His entire sequence of moves was smooth and fluid, executed in a single breath. Atami now had an extra hostage in his truck. Watching Atami speed away in his truck, Igor quickly ordered a tracked combat vehicle behind him to give chase. After the soldier in the truck was knocked out twice in a row by Atami, he had no choice but to obediently help him load his rifle. After chasing for a distance, Igor noticed that Atami had actually stopped the truck. Igor didn't continue forward. Instead, he stopped his vehicle at a distance to watch how things would unfold. Soon, the passenger side door opened and a figure jumped out of the truck. After taking out a few soldiers, Atami stepped out unhurriedly. With a determined look in his eyes, he raised his rifle and aimed at the two men in the vehicle.
Keep very still.
Igor knew better and sat there without daring to move another muscle. Atami also lowered his rifle. He didn't want to kill anyone, provided they didn't provoke him again. Having achieved his goal of intimidation, Atami drove his truck away from the scene. Igor got out, took a look at the blown-out tire, and threw the soldier in the passenger seat out. He had finally witnessed the tactics of this legendary warrior. After changing the spare tire, 4 motorcycle special ops soldiers arrived at the scene behind him. The men all wore bulletproof helmets and full steel armor, possessing not only great defense but also the mobility of their motorcycles. Igor waved his hand, and the men understood perfectly, taking off in pursuit one after another. Up ahead, Tommy drove his big truck, recklessly, and it wasn't long before he reached the main road. However, the logs on the truck were simply too heavy, and he hadn't driven far before Igor and his men caught up to him. Watching the motorcycles pass him one by one, Tommy decided to strike first. But the enemy was wearing level 4 helmets that ordinary bullets couldn't pierce at all, and he instead got his left cheek injured by the enemy's shotgun. Fortunately, Tommy was incredibly tough and forcefully steered the truck back onto the main road. But the 4 motorcycles surrounded him once again. Suddenly, one of the motorcycles crashed to the ground. It turned out that the motorcycle soldier had already climbed onto the roof of the truck. Hearing the noise, Tommy immediately opened the door and stood up, dodging a lethal strike. The soldier grabbed the hook from the vehicle's winch cable, swung himself onto the hood, and hurled the iron hook at Tommy, but was thrown to the ground by the inertia of the turning truck. The motorcycle soldier covered his head and managed to dodge 2 incoming motorcycles. Just as he was rejoicing over surviving, Igor drove his car right over him. He nonchalantly turned on his windshield wipers, scraping the blood off the glass. The pursuit continued. Another motorcycle charged forward. Just as the rider pulled out a double-barreled shotgun to fire, Tommy jerked the steering wheel, quickly crashing into a wrecked car on the side of the road. The motorcycle behind couldn't dodge in time and instantly bit the dust. The remaining 2 still refused to give up, and one of them sped up and charged forward. He repeated the old trick and climbed onto the truck. In just a moment of distraction from Tommy, the enemy had already lunged into the cab and almost kicked him out of the truck. At this moment, the other motorcycle also caught up. Tommy hastily pulled a grenade from the soldier's belt and jammed it right into the motorcycle's front wheel. Now there was only one last motorcycle soldier left. Tommy grabbed the iron hook nearby, looped it around the soldier's neck, and forcefully hurled him out. He then quickly returned to the cab and successfully engaged the winch. The steel cable dragged the soldier inch by inch toward the winch. No matter how he struggled, it was useless, and his neck was ultimately snapped in half. Seeing that all his men had met their maker, Igor slammed on the gas and caught up. He threw a lit Molotov cocktail onto the truck. Seeing his logs being reduced to ashes, Tommy's anger reached its peak. He ignored the explosion behind him and drove the truck down a narrow trail. He used the dense tree branches to scrape the open flames off the logs, then hit the brakes after driving a short distance. He quickly jumped out of the truck and used his clothes to beat down the smoldering logs. Afterward, he planned to rest for a while before setting off again. Unexpectedly, 2 airplanes roared past overhead. He hadn't expected the Soviet Union to actually send out fighter jets to hunt him down. Tommy didn't dare to delay. He hurriedly grabbed his beloved dog and drove off quickly. The 2 planes behind were already closing in, and the pilot in front even pushed the firing button. After a rapid burst of fire, the fighter jet screamed past. Then it quickly turned around and flew back behind the truck again. Tommy saw a warehouse not far away, so he immediately turned and drove toward it. The fighter jet overhead fired another rapid burst. Tommy drove the truck into the warehouse. He wasn't in a rush to react. Instead, he listened carefully to the sounds outside. It was dead silent all around, yet it sent waves of chills down his spine. Suddenly, a dense sound of air being ripped apart rang out, and wood chips instantly went flying from the roof. Unable to see what was happening outside, Tommy didn't know how to respond for a moment. At this moment, the fighter jet in the sky suddenly climbed sharply, reached a certain altitude, then abruptly turned its nose straight down, diving rapidly toward the warehouse below. Thanks to his plot armor, Tommy dodged the bombing and quickly drove his truck into the forest. The dense woods severely impaired the pilot's field of vision. Tommy also earned a brief moment to catch his breath, but the fighter jets overhead wouldn't give up so easily, and they soon spotted Tommy's truck. One of them swooped down, banking sideways, to fly low into the woods. After After successfully scoring a counterkill, Tommy observed for a while longer, and only after ensuring there was no danger did he step on the gas, driving over the plane's wreckage and speeding away. He thought the other fighter jet would back off in the face of difficulties, but little did he know that the plane was using the cliff for cover, hiding right beside him all along. After confirming the target's position, the pilot pulled the jet up to repeat the old trick, pulling off a slick U-turn in front of the truck and starting to strafe the oncoming vehicle again. Having gone through several rounds of shooting just now, his ammo quickly ran out. Throwing caution to the wind, this guy actually intended to fly the plane straight into the truck. He only ejected himself when the distance was incredibly close. Tommy had guessed his opponent's intentions, but he quickly came up with a plan. Watching the pilot slowly parachute down, Tommy wasn't in a hurry to mess with him, instead, minding his own business and loading the logs back onto the truck first. However, driven by a mission-accomplished determination, the pilot raised his pistol the moment he landed, using his terrible marksmanship to start shooting at Tommy. This finally pissed Tommy off, and he prepared to go over and finish off this bastard first. Seeing the aggressively approaching legendary warrior, he was clearly a bit panicked. As Tommy got closer, this guy actually revealed a hint of a smile. Tommy followed his gaze, only to discover another fighter jet flying in from the distance. Tommy knew he couldn't stick around here for long, so he didn't even bother killing this guy. He rushed back to his truck, hurriedly loaded the logs, and then slammed the gas pedal to make a quick getaway. As he passed by, the pilot smugly saluted him, but he wouldn't be smiling for long. After an unknown amount of time, Tommy finally woke up. The river water would soon fill the cab, and there was no time to lose. He grabbed his beloved dog, opened the window, and the man and his dog floated up to the surface. Suddenly, Tommy stopped again. He couldn't bear to leave the logs on the truck behind, so he turned around and swam back down to the sinking truck. Using all his strength, he untied the ropes binding the logs. After doing all this, he hugged a piece of wood and brought it with him as he floated to the surface. He gathered the logs together and then floated downstream. Not long after, Igor arrived at the location as well. He had his soldiers go down to salvage, but they only saw the truck sitting at the bottom of the water, with the logs and Tommy long gone. But he wasn't worried, because he knew Tommy's ultimate goal was to get back to Finland. By this time, Tommy had already reached the shore using a raft made from the logs. However, the scene before him made him freeze in place. A battle-damaged tank was sitting quietly right there. Now he had a vehicle to carry his logs across the border again. This was the Soviet border, and the smoke of World War II had just cleared. The ground was even scattered with plenty of weapons and ammunition that hadn't been evacuated in time. Tommy collected all of these, making preparations to cross the final checkpoint at the border. The next day, at the new border between the Soviet Union and Finland, Igor and his heavily armed troops had been standing guard all night, because he knew this was the only path Tommy could take to return to Finland. He suddenly noticed something amiss as all the birds in the forest took flight. He knew that monster had arrived. Sure enough, a tank could be seen driving over from a distance. Seeing this, Igor immediately stood up to inspect. A tank piled high with logs stopped right in front of them. It seemed Tommy had quite an attachment to these logs. He looked at the soldiers at the checkpoint, each one pointing their guns and standing in full combat readiness. He quickly lit the fuse he had prepared in advance, then started the tank and continued driving toward the border post. The billowing thick smoke behind him blotted out the sun and sky. The soldiers also began to open fire, but they couldn't penetrate the tank's armor. Tommy even cut the fuel line, gulped gasoline into his mouth, and blew it back into the line to squeeze out maximum horsepower.
Hold your position.
This insane move left Igor staring in dumbfounded shock. Tommy was also severely shaken up by it, but he still held on, picked up his dagger, and bit off the wooden grip, leaving only the bare metal handle. Nobody could guess what he was about to do. Then he opened the hatch on top of the tank, let his beloved dog go, and only then struggled to climb out of the cabin. Exhausted in the end, he collapsed onto the ground. Igor originally wanted to finish off this massive threat once and for all. Unexpectedly, several sedans carrying top military brass drove up. The higher-ups in those cars needed Atami alive. He was still of use. Though highly reluctant, Igor could only follow orders and holster his pistol. Atami was brought onto a train and strung up inside one of the boxcars. A soldier whipped Atami with a live electrical cable until his flesh was torn open, yet he didn't utter a single sound begging for mercy. Igor walked into the boxcar and shooed the soldier away. He excitedly stated that he had killed countless women and children in his life, but one particular boy had left a deep impression on him.
Otava. Tough little fucker. Make any father proud. He tried hard to protect his little brother and his mother. We chopped them all into small pieces with an iron shovel.
It was only at this moment that Atami learned his family had been murdered by Igor. Atami's fury reached its absolute peak, but Igor didn't care. In his eyes, this old man was no different from a corpse. But little did he know what consequences would come from provoking this monster. Atami suspended himself upside down in midair, then pushed with all the strength in his legs. Even though his hands were torn open, he didn't feel the slightest bit of pain. Finally, fighting through excruciating pain, he pulled a dagger out from under the skin of his thigh. It turned out he had actually hidden that dagger inside his thigh. The commotion in the boxcar finally caught the attention of the guards. A bald soldier walked in first. Seeing the motionless Atami, he suppressed his fear and stepped forward to check on him. The soldier hurriedly checked the situation inside, and seeing his comrade nod, he finally opened the main door. Meanwhile, the officials in the front train car were still immersed in a drunken stupor. Igor asked about his payment only to be brushed off by the superior in front of him. He wasn't going to hand any payment over to Igor. In his eyes, letting this former death row inmate live was already the greatest gift. At this time, Atami, wielding a pickaxe, had already reached the next train car. He didn't expect that this was exactly where the soldiers slept. Not daring to make a single sound, he slowly crept forward while watching the soldiers' every move. Unexpectedly, a soldier returning from the bathroom suddenly stepped back into the car. And to make matters worse, another soldier nearby also woke up. With quick hands and sharp eyes, Atami brutally stabbed the guy in the kidneys repeatedly, putting him to sleep forever. After taking care of the two men, Atami quickly exited the car and used the pickaxe to jam the door shut. He opened a small window on the third train car, which was full of wide-awake soldiers on standby. Atami knew he couldn't just barge in by force. He changed into the dead soldier's uniform and climbed onto the roof of the train. He originally wanted to head straight across the roof to the car where Igor was, but the exhaust gas from the train made it impossible for him to even open his eyes. Atami ended up returning to the previous train car. He swiftly snatched a gun and successfully took down two soldiers. The other soldiers reacted and fired frantically at Atami's position. Atami used the fallen soldiers to block the attacks, and once the enemies had emptied their magazines, it was time for Atami to put on a show. Igor heard the noise too, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he walked out of his train car alone. Only then did he realize the train car ahead was riddled with holes and shooting out sparks. He could obviously guess what had happened, but he wasn't in a panic. Instead, he calmly kicked open the latch connecting the train cars. By the time Atami fought his way through the train level and stepped out, he found the car ahead getting further and further away from him. But this couldn't stump the legendary warrior at all. He turned to look at the massive object covered by a torn cloth. A bold idea instantly flashed into his mind. Back at the dining table, Igor pulled out his pistol the moment he sat down. Igor had long seen that the other party wanted to get rid of him once he outlived his usefulness, so he chose to strike first. The superior still tried to bribe Igor with a suitcase full of cash.
This is for you.
And this is for you.
Igor thought he was going to be the ultimate winner. What he didn't know was that a grand gift from Atami was arriving right on schedule. Propelled by the rocket thruster, the train car barreled toward Igor's car at blistering speed. The violent shaking made Igor realize something was wrong. enemies meet, their eyes blaze with hatred. The two immediately locked into a brutal brawl, but Atami, having gone through battles all the way here, was already drained of energy. Igor pinned him tightly into the corner using the dining table. After kicking him over and over again, Atami finally stopped moving. Igor grabbed the suitcase of cash and stumbled toward the exit, but the very next second, Atami charged at him again. Igor shoved his head down into the sink. Atami snatched up a fork nearby and stabbed viciously at his opponent. But this couldn't inflict much damage. Igor pinned him underneath, then picked up a steel pipe and started beating the hell out of Atami. Even if Atami was known as the immortal god of war, his body was already at the end of its rope. Believing victory was in his grasp, Igor snatched up a shovel. He wanted Atami to feel the same agony his family felt when they were murdered. By this point, Atami was already beaten to a bloody pulp. He mustered every last ounce of strength and crawled toward the missile. At this moment, Igor naively thought he had won again. Little did he know that the screws on the missile had already been removed by Atami. Completely unexpectedly, the missile slid perfectly straight and stopped right in front of Igor. Atami also took this opportunity to uncouple the connection between the train cars. Igor thought he had survived a disaster and flashed a happy smile. But the very next second, as the story came to an end, Atami made his wish come true and returned to Finland. His deeds had long spread, and he became a national hero in the mouths of the people. With the help of the villagers, he finally settled down into a peaceful life.